So I am not adopted, but I have a background that's very similar to someone who has been adopted. And that's because I grew up as an only child, also like Anna, yay for only children, with a single mom and no visible father in the picture ever. And so that was kind of plaguing for me for a while. I think, I didn't really ask a lot of questions until I was around 5, maybe 6, and I'm like, oh, where's my dad? And she's like, oh, well, he lives somewhere else. And, there were a lot of secrets, there were just a lot of information that was missing from my life as I grew up. And so as you can imagine, I was a pretty angry and effed up kid as a result. But I spent a lot of time wondering and fantasizing about, this father that lived out there somewhere. And this is a true story. There was actually a real time in my life that I thought my father could be Mick Jagger. And that's because I have big lips, and so does Mick Jagger. And he also loved to dance, and I grew up as a dancer also. And he loved rock and roll, and I loved rock and roll. And I knew that he had a lot of girlfriends. I knew that my mom was single, and I had envisioned that maybe they had this past relationship. And as I grew up, I thought maybe she just couldn't tell me about it. And so about 7 years ago, I had an opportunity to meet my real dad for the first time, and it was not Mick Jagger. It was an Irish man, and a lot of my life kind of came into fruition at that time because there were a few things about him that I learned that I think were very, so the circumstances were that they had a brief relationship in the 70s and a very terrible partying, and my mom leaves, and she finds out she's pregnant. She ends up going back to South Dakota and having me, and my father had been from Michigan, and so she assumes he goes back to Michigan as well too. But what had happened is my mom ended up moving back to the DC area with me, and they had met here in the DC area, and I was a little girl. I was in elementary school. And my father, unbeknownst to me, had also stayed in the DC area and was running a moving company in this area. And so 7 years ago, when I finally had sort of the facts, I knew his name, I knew about how old he was, I knew that he had been a furniture mover in the past. I, through the power of the internet, which is amazing, got online, and I learned that my dad lived 3 miles away from me for most of my life. And so it was this really remarkable story of kind of how we got back together, but I relate a lot to sort of the topic of adoption because I grew up without knowing half of who I was for most of my life, and when I met my dad, there were a couple of things I learned. Number one, that I was really a complete person when I met him, which was pretty awesome, because I think if it had been a decade before when I was just sad and depressed and felt sorry for myself all the time and drank a lot and smoked cigarettes, I think it would have been a disaster. But the second thing was that there were things that we had in common. And some of those things are eyebrows. I would say I probably have my mom's lips more than my dad's. And a business-like sense. He's a businessman. And so it's been a really interesting experience to kind of get to know this person. And the only way I can relate to it is by talking to people who've been adopted, who've had a similar experience. And while I am still slightly disappointed that my dad is not Mick Jagger, Patrick Fitzgerald is a pretty cool guy.